If you've never built a chopper before and you clicked on this video, congratulations, because you are ahead of 90% of chopper builders out there that fail to ask the most important question you could possibly ask for your first build. What bike should you choose? Failing to ask that question can oftentimes be the difference between a failed project that ends up back on Craigslist where you found it versus a completed build that takes you deeper down the rabbit hole, deeper into the chopper culture. It all hinges on picking the right bike. So you've come to the right place. Today, I'm going to take you through my 4 recommendations for your first build, why I picked the ones I did, and why you might choose one versus the other. So let's get into all of it. You're watching Grease's Garage, and I'm going to help you skip the struggle. Before I give you the list, I feel like I need to answer one other question you might have, which is, who cares what I think? Grease's Garage is just some guy on YouTube with an Evo Big Twin. Doesn't even own a shovel. How can I trust him? So let me just give you briefly my experience with this. I've built 2 bikes from the hardtail up. One was a metric bike, one was a Harley. So don't feel like I'm playing favorites with this list. I've seen both sides. And I also had a 3rd build, which I, to quote a Craigslist favorite, went in a different direction on because it was the wrong platform and I didn't have the skill set to do what needed to be done. So I've seen all sides of this personally, but also I was a co-host of the Low Life Chopper podcast, where for 5 years, every single week, we interviewed a builder from across the world, talked about what went right, what went wrong, all the different bikes. Trust me, if you can think of a bike, I have interviewed a person who built one. So what you're getting in this video today is me synthesizing all of that information for you into an easily digestible list to give you a good starting place. Now, why does it matter so much what bike you choose? Why not just chop what you have? And the answer is that there are 4 things that go into building a bike: time, money, emotional investment, and the opportunity cost, what you could have been doing if you weren't doing that. So let's start with the time. 1 year minimum. No questions asked. If this is your first build, you'll be lucky if you get it done in a year. Lucky. Unless you have a friend who's super talented at this that can walk you through the process step by step. Second one is money. $2,000 minimum. If you can do it for less, think again. There's no way you're doing it for less. We will go through in a future video what it costs to build a chopper. And if that is a video you're looking forward to seeing, write that down in the comments below and I will bump that up in the video list. Next, emotional investment. You are going to get attached to this bike and you don't want to have that heartbreaking moment where you realize it's just not the bike you wish it was. I'm speaking from experience on that. I had 2 builds go that way. So trust me when I say you will get attached. You want to get attached to the right bike. And the last thing is the opportunity cost. This bike you're building now, if it doesn't turn out the way you wanted because you chose the wrong platform, that's a whole year you spent and thousands of dollars you spent on a project that just isn't what you really wanted. So take the time, ask the question now, and get yourself set up properly. First bike on our list today is the Harley Shovelhead. Cool factor on this one, 5 out of 5. There is nowhere that you can't go if you pick a Shovelhead as your first bike. Whether it's a vintage bike show, you'll never have to worry about being on the other side of the gate because your bike is too new. It's just not quite cool enough to be in the show. You got to park it over there. That'll never happen to you on a Shovelhead. So cool factor, 5 out of 5. As far as the price, this is the most expensive bike on our list. Now, with Shovelheads running from 66 all the way through 1984, you have a wide variety of prices. The older you go, the more expensive it'll be. The closer you get to 84, the less money you'll spend on the bike initially. Now, for your first build, I don't think it matters all that much. Yes, the generator shovels that ran from 66 to 69 are cooler, but for your first build, if you can get your hands on any Shovelhead, I'd say that's a solid bet. But overall, the price, I'd give it a 3 out of 5 because, like I said, it is the most expensive on our list. But remember, you only have to do this once if you pick the right bike. So even though the Shovelhead might be more expensive than the Sportsters or some of the metric bikes we'll talk about later, if it's the only bike you build and you have it for the next 2 decades, you're not going to remember the difference in the upfront cost of the Shovelhead versus those other bikes. Just something to keep in mind. Next up is the motor. So the Shovelhead did have a 1200cc version, which ran from 66 to 78. And then in 78 to 84, it got bumped up to an 80 cubic inch motor, or 1340cc. Both of these motors are plenty highway capable. The way that the transmission is geared makes the Shovelhead a highway bike. I've known plenty of people with the 74 cubic inch 1200cc version that run on the highway, no problem whatsoever. So as far as the motor size, it's something you can grow into. It's something that you can have forever. For the motor, I give it a 5 out of 5 stars. As far as the overall size of the bike, this is also the biggest bike on our list. So if you are over 6 feet tall, over 200 pounds, I highly recommend going with a big twin. You're just going to have a little bit more room to stretch out. They have floorboard options. You can do forwards. It's going to give you the most space. So if you are a larger rider, 5 out of 5 on the size of the Shovelhead. Next up, we got popular mods. Some of the things we like as chopper guys just aren't possible on every bike. So let's say you want something like a Kickstarter. Very possible on a Shovelhead, probably more likely than not, it comes with one off the bat. If you want to do an open primary, totally possible on a Shovelhead. Foot clutch, very easy to set up. Jockey shift, also very easy to set up. If you're buying a Shovelhead and you have a rotary top transmission, so the later models, the less expensive models, I've actually got a video which I'll link up here showing you how to build a foot clutch jockey shift setup for your Shovelhead for less than 50 bucks. It's crazy. Super easy to work with, a great platform for some of those mods. If you're into the super fancy stuff, you want to go all the way with this build, this is a bike that you could put a magneto on. You could go to points. There's just, the options are endless. There's nothing you can't do on a Shovelhead. So a great option for you to start with. Next up is stock components. Now we're going to get into some pros and some cons in this section with the Shovelhead. One of the pros is most of them, not all of them, but most of them came with a chain final drive, which means that you won't, if you do a hardtail, you won't have to then buy a chain conversion, get a sprocket, get all of the accessories that go along with that. And that can be a couple $100. It's not nothing. So if you buy a Shovelhead, more than likely it's going to come chain drive. You don't have to spend that extra money. That's one of the pros. One of the cons is that some of the design on these older bikes was not the best. The exhaust has only one mounting bolt. That's not a great way to mount an exhaust when you're trying to get a nice secure fit. Sometimes those studs can crack and it can be a little bit of a pain to replace. So with that extra cool factor comes a little bit of a reduction in the design elements. On that same topic, you also have an intake manifold on the Shovelhead that can be kind of a pain to work with. Not that it can't be figured out, but it's a little less plug and play than something like an Evo Big Twin. Some of those issues with the intake manifold causing intake manifold leaks, the way it all hooks up, it's just not quite as refined as it is on the newer bikes. Something to be aware of if you're the type of person who doesn't want to fuss with that sort of thing at all. Also, if you do a hardtail on a Shovelhead and you ditch the factory oil tank, one thing to keep in mind is that the oil filter is built into the oil tank on the Shovelheads. So once you ditch that tank, now you need to find a way to mount a remote oil filter or run no filter at all, which I do not recommend. Lowbrow does make a kit for this. I think it's like between 50 and 100 bucks, a remote oil filter kit, but just a reminder that it's an extra step that you'll have to deal with on the Shovelhead that you wouldn't have to deal with on some of the other bikes we're going to talk about. To summarize, the Shovelhead overall score, I give it 5 out of 5 stars. It's an excellent bike that you can grow into, that you can keep forever, that you will never feel like you have to build another bike if you start with a Shovelhead off the bat. Great first option, higher upfront cost, but down the road, there's nothing you can't do with that bike. It is a one bike fits all type purchase. Next bike on our list is the Evo Big Twin. This is my personal chopper. This is what I chose for my build, and I love it. The Evo Big Twin, excellent, excellent bike for your choice of a first build. Now, let's start it off the way we started off the Shovelhead, with the price. I bought my Evo Big Twin in 2020 or 2021, right around there, for $3,500, and that was for a fully running bike, all the factory tins, everything included, ride at home. So the price, I give it a 4 out of 5. This is a slightly less expensive option than a Shovelhead, but there are some trade-offs that you get. Less expense up front, but little less cool factor. When it comes to the cool factor on an Evo Big Twin, I give it 4 out of 5. The Shovelhead was 5. That thing can go anywhere and blend in no matter where you're going. The Evo Big Twin, while still a very cool bike and still one of my favorite bikes, it would not fit in at a 84 and before vintage bike type event. It's a little bit too new for that scene. So you do get a little bit of trade-off with that extra reliability of a newer bike. It's not quite as cool as the Shovelhead, the true vintage bikes. Next up, hardtailing. On the Evo Big Twin, you can use, as I used, a Shovelhead hardtail, but it's going to take a little bit more work. The Shovelhead hardtail is not necessarily made for an Evo Big Twin. It requires a little bit of modification. If this is something you're interested in, I'd be happy to walk you through it. You can always reach out to me and I'll help you along with that process. But I would give the hardtailing process a 2 out of 5 for the Evo Big Twin because it requires a little more fabrication expertise on your end. If you have someone in your area that does hardtails, it's nothing that that person couldn't handle, but it might be a little much for a first-time chopper builder to do it themselves. So 2 out of 5 on the hardtailing process. Next, the motor. Now the motor on the Evos are 80 cubic inch or 1340 cc. My bike will run on the highway, no problem whatsoever, at 80 miles an hour for as many miles as it needs to go. Great, great choice of motor. There's some design updates on this motor over the Shovelhead that make it a little more desirable. We talked about the exhaust flanges on the Shovelhead being a single bolt. On the Evo, they ditched that design. They went to the 2 bolts, much more secure way to mount an exhaust. Additionally, that oil filter situation, it's not a built-in oil filter on the Evo Big Twin. It's mounted up front in front of the motor, where you can get plenty of cooling, and if you do a hardtail, you do not have to change anything. You can retain your stock oil filter, which is pretty cool. In addition to that, on this motor, they also fixed that intake manifold problem. A lot easier. I have never messed with an intake manifold on a Harley before. This Evo Big Twin was my first Harley, and I can tell you it was a walk in the park. No special instructions needed. When I took the top end apart and I put it back together, everything went together perfectly. They crushed it on the intake manifold with the Evo Big Twin. So those design elements will be a lot more helpful to you down the road versus having to struggle with some of the way that the Shovelhead was designed. Next up, the overall size of the bike. The Evo Big Twin and the Shovelhead are the same size. The whole front of the motor in the frame area, it's all exactly the same. And after you hardtail it, it will be 100% the same. So again, if you're over 6 foot, over 200 pounds, the Shovelhead or the Evo Big Twin, the size, I'd give it a 5 out of 5. These are bigger, more room for a larger rider, no matter, or if you want to ride with a passenger, both of them just have a little bit more space for everybody to get comfortable. It's a bike that you can grow with. Next up is chopper modifications, popular things, right? Now on the Evo Big Twin, you have a 5-speed transmission. If you've been watching my channel, you know I ditched that transmission for a Shovelhead transmission. I went to the 4-speed because it makes things like foot clutch jockey shift setups a little easier. Now let's talk about popular chopper modifications, things you might want to do to the bike. First up, we got things like installing a Kickstarter, just as easy as would be on a shovel head. There are kits around $300 that you could throw on there and have a Kickstarter on your bike. It's that simple. Things like foot clutching and jockey shifting setups. There are people making jockey shifters for the stock Evo 5-speed. I think Prism Supply makes one, and there's probably a couple other people making them. Very easy to get a shifter on there. To get a foot clutch on there is a little bit trickier. You have a cable on the Evo Big Twin, which comes out the right-hand side of the bike. On the shovel head, you have an arm, a mechanical arm, which routes on the left-hand side. It's a lot easier to do a foot clutch with a shovel head than it is with an Evo Big Twin, but it can be done. I had a cable-driven setup on my bike for 1 year, and then I ended up switching the transmission out, which is another benefit to the Evo Big Twin. The transmissions are swappable. So if you decide you want to go to a 4-speed, you can go to a 4-speed, or you can keep the 5-speed. Things like open belt. A lot of people like the open belt in the chopper world. You can easily do that on an Evo Big Twin. Very simple to set it up. Stock components. Now, this depends heavily on which model of Evo Big Twin you buy, but more likely than not, it's going to come with a belt final drive, which is not ideal. If you do a hardtail, you're going to want to ditch the belt and go to a chain, which means you do have to buy the sprocket, the chain itself, and the front transmission sprocket as well, which can be a couple $100. It's not the most inexpensive thing. It's something to consider. So stock components between the transmission, if you're looking to do the foot clutch and the jockey shift, the transmission not being totally ideal, and the belt drive from the factory not being totally ideal, overall, I would give the stock components on the Evo Big Twin a 3 out of 5. Now, overall score for the Evo Big Twin, I give it 4 out of 5 stars for your first chopper project. There's a lot of opportunity in this bike, tons of stuff for you to play with and mess around with, infinite parts adjustability. You could put a magneto on the thing, open belt, foot clutch, jockey shift, all of it. Not quite as easy as a shovel head, but it's still out there, still a possibility for you. So 4 out of 5 stars on the Evo Big Twin. Next up in our list, we've got the Evo Sportster. Now, this is probably the most popular choice for somebody's first chopper build, and it is an awesome choice for your first chopper build. Couple reasons for that. We're going to get into that now. First is the price. Compared to the shovel head and the Evo Big Twin, the Evo Sportster is the most affordable of the options we've talked about thus far. I do list price out as the first option in all of these bikes that we're talking about, but I don't want that to be the most important thing or the first thing you think about, because you are going to spend thousands of dollars on this build after the fact. So the Evo Sporty entry cost is the lowest. So as far as the price, 5 out of 5 stars. These things are everywhere. They're super available. And no matter what year or specific version you're looking for, you can probably find one locally for a great price. Next up is the cool factor. Now, I know this is going to ruffle some feathers, but compared to a shovel head, an Evo Sportster just does not have that same cool factor. I'm going to give this one a 3 out of 5. The Ironhead Sportsters have a little bit more cool factor, but for a million reasons, the Ironhead Sportster is not on this list. I highly don't recommend that you go with an Ironhead Sportster. If you're going with a Sportster, go with an Evo for your first build. Next category is the motor. Now, this one, again, is going to ruffle some feathers. Have you noticed the trend here? When you talk, anytime you talk about Sportsters, people are upset. It's just, there's no getting around it. You say, you know what I don't like about a Sportster? And people are, that's BS. So the motor is a little underpowered. The 883 is a little underpowered. Most people who have an 883 will eventually either upgrade to the 1200 or look at a big twin down the road. I could tell you 5 people that I know personally who started with Evo Sportsters and now own or are building big twins. It is the natural evolution of it. So I think part of that is the lower entry cost of an Evo Sportster. It's less money down up front. It drives a lot of people to buy that for their first build. But if you're going to end up building a big twin later on, something to think about. Maybe that's worth saving the money up front in building that big twin from the jump. So the motor size, it is highway capable. 1200s and 883s both can go on the highway, but I can tell you I've ridden next to 883s on my big twin. One is working a lot harder than the other. So for the motor, I'm going to give it a 3 out of 5. The overall size of the bike. Now the Sportster is a smaller bike than a Shovelhead or an Evo Big Twin. For reference, I'm not a big guy. I'm 5'10", about 190 pounds. Personally, I don't fit on a Sportster. If that Sportster has mids, no way. Unless that front end is way extended and the hardtail is extended and I got room for my legs, but a stock Sportster with mids, I can't do it. And again, I'm not even over 6 feet. So for all the people that are 6 feet and plus, 200 pounds and up, I just don't recommend it. For the size of the Evo Sporty, I'm going to give it a 3 out of 5. For smaller riders, people probably my height and below, it's probably going to be more suited for you guys than for the bigger riders. Popular chopper mods. So here's where we get into some difference between the two bikes we talked about so far and the Evo Sportster. Things like adding a kicker on an Evo Sportster, that's like a $300 upgrade on an Evo Big Twin. On a Sportster, that's like a $1,000 upgrade. So remember when I talked in the beginning about your time, your money, the emotional investment, and the opportunity cost. When you start looking at these things, maybe a kicker doesn't matter to you. Maybe it's not a big deal. But if it's going to down the road, just be aware up front that that's a little bit trickier to do on a Sportster than it is on a Big Twin. Like I said, remember that figure, about $1,000 for the good kit if you want to add that. Things like a open belt primary, very, very difficult on an Evo Sportster. I believe Rivera is the only one that makes that kit, and I'm not even sure if they make it anymore. I would have to double check on that. So feel free to Google it. Let me know if you're running an open belt on your Sportster, but you almost never see it. I've been to every chopper event in the Northeast, it seems like, and I can't tell you even one time that I saw an Evo Sporty with an open belt. So if that's something that matters to you, just be aware that's not available for you readily. When it comes to foot clutch and jockey shift, that is possible on the Evo Sportster. There's a couple companies that make like a very short cable, because on an Evo Sportster, the clutch cable comes out the left-hand side of the case, right behind where your foot would go. So it's actually not difficult to rig up a setup to make it a foot clutch and a jockey shift, but it is a little more difficult than it would be on a Shovelhead, and a little more difficult, or I would say as difficult as it would be on the Evo Big Twin. So if those are mods that you're interested in, just be aware. Hardtailing. Hardtailing, this is where the Evo Sportster shines. This is 5 out of 5, the easiest bike to hardtail. It is super plug and play. Companies like Lowbrow Customs, so you see up in the sign over here, they make a great hardtail kit for the Evo Sportster. The motor is the jig, so you do not need a frame jig in order to weld this up. Very plug and play, tons and tons of options, and they're very affordable. So if you're hardtailing a bike, 5 out of 5 on the Evo Sporty. One of the best bikes you could get for that project. Stock components. Now the Evo Sportster, just like the Evo Big Twin, is most likely going to come with a belt drive. So if you go to do a hardtail conversion, you're also going to have to buy the chain conversion. So figure another couple $100 to get all the parts you need to convert that over. You'll have to get the sprocket, the front and rear. You'll have to get the chain itself, and depending on which wheel you've got, you might have to do a little bit of spacer work to get it all to line up properly. So it is possible. The kits are available. They're on Lowbrow. They're on other websites. They're everywhere. So you won't have trouble finding it, but you do need to be aware that it doesn't come ready for that ultimate hardtail setup. The oil tank is another thing on the Sportsters that can be a little trickier than it is on the Big Twins. The Evo Sportsters, once you go hardtail, you're pretty much locked into one of those pill-style oil tanks. There are a couple companies that make the horseshoe-style oil tanks, but because of the way the Sporty frame is, it doesn't work quite the same. The down tube for the seat post is right in the middle of where that horseshoe oil tank would go. So if you're one of these people who likes, like I do, to run the horseshoe oil tank and put your battery inside of it, that's really not an option on the Sportster. Most people end up tucking the battery down at the base of the seat post, right behind the motor. Just something to be aware of. I'll be rolling in a couple clips here of various people's builds so you can see what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the battery area. Overall, on the Evo Sportster, I would give this a 3 out of 5 for an overall score as your first build. Tons of aftermarket options, parts galore, parts availability, and even locally. Sometimes the dealerships won't stock parts for older bikes like the Shovelheads and the Ironheads, but the Evo Big Twin and the Evo Sportster, you can still get from Harley themselves the oil filters you need, some of the parts that you need. You do have a little bit more option to get stuff locally for something like an Evo Sportster. So it's a great platform to build on. You can make it into whatever you want it to look like. It's just something to keep in mind of whether you want to start with that and then build a Big Twin later, or you want to build a Big Twin right off the bat. I just don't know too many people who only build a Sportster and never end up wanting a Big Twin later on. All right, guys, the last bike on my top 4 list is the Yamaha XS650. This was my first build. I learned a ton of stuff by building this bike, and let's go through all of the categories now. First up, price. This is the most affordable bike on the list. I bought mine for 400 bucks. Mine was in terrible shape, but for 1,500 bucks, these things are everywhere. Cheaper than Evo Sporties, cheaper than Evo Big Twins, cheaper than Shovelheads. Nothing is going to set you back less than the XS650 as far as the initial cost. Now, when it comes to the cool factor on the XS650, I give it a 4 out of 5. It's an old bike, and it looks like an old bike. You see that motor, they styled it after the older Triumphs, so it's got that parallel twin look. It's a cool bike, and it comes with a kicker from the factory, which is pretty neat. So you never have to feel like you're not part of the cool crowd when everybody's kicking their bikes and all you can do is push a button. The motor. This is where it starts to get dicey. Like I said, I'm not bashing the XS650. I built an XS650 as my first bike, and it is a great bike, but the motor is underpowered. It's a 650cc. There are 750 kits available, and if you are interested in doing a build on an XS650, I highly recommend that you buy that 750 kit and install it. They also make an overdrive 5th gear. If you're doing a motor rebuild that you could put in, I highly recommend you buy that as well. I have owned this bike. I have ridden this bike at 70 miles an hour, and it is screaming at 70 miles an hour. There's other things you can do. There's rephasing. There's a whole variety of stuff, but you're talking big bucks for some of this stuff. So as far as the motor, to keep this simple, keep from rambling, the motor, I give it a 2 out of 5. It's a small motor. You're going to end up wanting more motor. No question about it. The size of the bike. This is another part where the XS650 gets a 2 out of 5. It's a very small bike. I'm 5'10", 190. Like I said before, when we're talking about the Evo Sporties, those are small. The XS is smaller than that. I didn't realize this when I was first building it. Mine was a total basket case. I never really saw the scale of the bike when I bought it. And for me, it was very tiny. I had to put the forward controls on it as far forward as you could put them without hitting the tire. And even then, I still felt like I didn't have enough room on this bike. So if you're over 6 feet, do not go with an XS650. If you're over 200 pounds, do not go with an XS650. You're going to wish in the end that you went with a bigger bike. Popular chopper mods. So this is where the XS650 shines. There are tons of aftermarket support for it. Lowbrow Customs has all kinds of stuff on there that you could buy specific for this bike. Foot clutch jockey shift setups. It will require a bit of machining to make a modified worm gear, but the foot clutch I had on my XS650 was phenomenal. Rock solid setup. I don't know if the guy is still making them. It was Black Betty on XS650.com. For, I believe it was 150 bucks. He made me a custom worm gear, and then I made the rest of the linkage to hook it up. Very easy to do. It all comes out the left-hand side of the case. So if a foot clutch jockey shift option is something you're interested in, just know it can be done on the XS650. It's not crazy expensive, but it does require a little bit of machining work. Now, when it comes to hardtailing, the XS650 is a decent option for hardtails. I hardtailed mine. The hardtail kit that it comes with is pretty good. I believe I got the TC Bros one. There's a lot of other people that make these hardtail kits now, and the only thing I'll say is it's not as plug and play as it is with some other bikes. I would recommend using a jig if you're going to do an XS650 hardtail. It'll just make the process a lot easier for you, and there's a lot more to cut on an XS650, and the cuts are a little bit trickier than what you would get on an Evo Sportster or on the Evo Big Twin or the Shovelhead. So hardtailing, I give it a 3 out of 5. Stock components. Not the best area for the XS650. It really doesn't come with a lot of stuff that you're going to want to keep. If you're into choppers and you're looking to make a hardtail chopper out of it, you're going to throw away most of what comes with this bike. The tank is not great. The whole rear section of the bike is kind of a cafe racer setup, so you're probably going to end up ditching all of it. And the only positive thing of that is that you can then start from the ground up and make it how you want. It also does come with a chain from the factory. So that is a benefit, is you don't have to do a chain conversion once you go to a hardtail. You already have those components with you. So that's one benefit to it. But outside of that, there isn't much, including the charging system, that you'll want to hang on to. Most of that's going to get replaced, and it'll be, I would ballpark yourself $1,000 getting all the parts that you would want to upgrade from the stock components. Overall, the XS650, I give it a 3 out of 5 as your first project. If you're under 5'10", maybe 170 and below, this could be an option for you to look at if the cost really is prohibitive. If you can't go with the American bikes and you want to go with a metric bike, this is probably the best one to go with. But I would say it'd be, out of the 4, it's my lowest on the recommendation list. Certainly will teach you a lot of things, but there's other things that are just a little trickier with a metric bike. For example, you want to put new wheels on. You want to put a 21 spool in the front. On a Harley, you would just bolt that right on. On a metric bike, you get into bearing conversions. You might have to have somebody custom make you a set of bearings in order to make the swap. Little things like that, or you want to put a Springer front end on. It's just a little trickier than it is on a Harley, on an American bike. So just something to keep in mind. Don't let the lower upfront cost be the only deciding factor. Listen to these other points. I've talked to a lot of people, myself included. If I could go back and do it again, I wouldn't have picked the XS650 for my first bike. It'd be a great second bike to have in the stable. Something that wouldn't cost a lot of money. You could build it, ride it around town. But for my first bike, I did the XS650, and I wished that I had gone with a Big Twin from the start. So we made it to the end of our list, but there's one other point that I wanted to cover in this video, because I know I'll get this question, and I've gotten this question on the podcast many, many times, which is, but Grease, what about insert bike here? I got this bike, from my dad. It was his bike, and I want to make it my first chopper. Or you got it from a buddy that's no longer with you, and it has sentimental value to you. Here's my advice on that. Keep that bike. Keep that bike, ride it as it is, enjoy that bike, appreciate the connection that you have with that bike. But it does not have to be your chopper project. And I know that there's a big influx in the community of the sentiment of chop what you got. And I understand that. Like I said, I had a Yamaha Roadstar that I foot clutch, jockey shifted. I did all sorts of things to that bike. But in the end, I ended up buying another bike because I wanted a kicker, and it just would never have been an option on that bike. I wanted to slim things down, and there's just certain elements of that bike that couldn't be changed. And I hope that this video can help you understand that it's not that someone's trying to tell you you can't do it. It can be done, but for your first build, while you're building the skill set to actually work on bikes this way, you need something that's going to set you up for success. If you pick an obscure, random bike for your first build, you're going to run into so many headaches to which there are no roadmap because you're the only one that's working with that bike. So please take my advice, get this first build under your belt with a bike that has a big audience and a big platform for you to learn from. And then in the future, if you want to take that bike with sentimental value and you want to chop it up because you've gained the skills to do it, go ahead. But for the first one, keep it simple. So I hope this video helped narrow your focus so that you can make the best decision on what the proper first bike is for you to build. Please subscribe if you're enjoying the content. Share it with a friend who needs this kind of information, and I will catch you guys next week.